And without more ado, I will ask Tim to take the podium and give us his interpretation of the Anglosphere vision. Thank you, Tim.
Brilliant. Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to say a quick thank you to the Freedom Association for continually supporting my paper and backing it from the beginning. The same goes to Ruth Lee, who kindly gave me the idea almost 1 year ago, and also to Andrew Rosendale for kindly writing the foreword and always being there when I needed him to help out, so thank you both. Okay, it's always customary to start with a quote, so let's go with The Economist that we just have up here. It says, "Talk of the Commonwealth forming a dynamic, like-minded, free-trading core of a British global network for prosperity is, to use a technical term, cobblers." So there we have it. This panel and much of the audience are talking cobblers because The Economist says so. Their article is entitled "The Ultimate Eurosceptic Fantasy, Putting Faith in the Commonwealth." This concerns me somewhat because there seems to be an idea that the Commonwealth is a relic of empire. And I think this is wrong. What I envisage is a network of shopkeepers where we can have poorer Commonwealth nations trade their way out of poverty, not by using aid. I want a positive business ethos, not a political architecture. As you can see from here, I've used the four corners of the United Kingdom to show the positive benefits of trade with the four corners of the Commonwealth. Right, let's have a few statistics. If we combine all Commonwealth nations' GDP together, it stands at $8.4 trillion US dollars. It also has a combined growth rate of 3.7%, which is higher than its African and Asian parts. It also is predicted to have a labour force to increase by over 60% by 2050. If we compare that to the European Union, their total growth this year is minus 0.2%, which is paltry. And they've also got a workforce decreasing by 50 million by 2050. The Commonwealth also has an ability to trade on a 24/7 basis, simply because it's scattered all over the globe. You can be a Canadian business that has its paperwork done in London, and then all that paperwork and that business can be floated on the Singapore Stock Exchange. It is a cyclical thing that happens 24/7. Another point I'd like to introduce is the idea that the Commonwealth outperforms EU nations on a variety of economic and world rankings. One example is Rwanda. For starting a business, it comes in 8th in the whole world, whereas Germany comes 98th. And if you're a businessman, I think you know which one you're going to invest in and start your business. Another point I'd like to make clear is this isn't just about armchair philosophy. I've gone out into the field, I've interviewed high commissions and high commissioners, members of parliament, lords, economists, and businessmen, and they tell me the Commonwealth is worth investing in. Also, I don't want to just bang the drum only for it to fall silent. The recommendations I have are about practicality. A few of them here is a Commonwealth investment bank that should be set up, also a Commonwealth business visa that will allow businessmen to move between Commonwealth countries more easily and cheaper. Other ideas are a variant on Andrew Rosendale's own Commonwealth Realm airport queue, which I support greatly. And I have other ideas on education, and this is the biggest thing. We need the young, especially in our country, to lift their eyes above the EU horizon. There is another world out there. There's the Commonwealth and the Anglosphere. Also, I wanted to take this time to discuss about ASEAN, which is a Southeast Asian economic bloc. Now, what they have is simply trade. There is no political architecture or machinations. That's all they do, trade. Most recently, they had a trade expo with China, and it filled 3 to 4 football pitches. This is what we should be doing with the growth sectors of the world. Also, my most ambitious idea is to have a linked Commonwealth Stock Exchange. Now, I said it is ambitious, but when we crunch the numbers, it comes at 10.4 trillion US dollars, making it the second largest stock exchange if it were created, only second behind New York. Also, I call for a Commonwealth Trade Minister to be set up. Unfortunately, Lord Howe, the Commonwealth Minister, was demoted during the reshuffle, and unfortunately his successor has placed the Commonwealth very low down his remit, and in fact has never spoken about the Commonwealth, and this greatly worries me and makes my call for a Commonwealth Trade Minister much more apparent. I've got many more recommendations, but I urge you to buy the book and you can read more of them in detail later on. I also want to touch upon Ruth Lee's work that she's done about the EU, and specifically the EU Customs Union. I think that the EU Customs Union is outdated, and we're wedded to this ideal that we should just leave. We have no WTO seats as well, and if you believe in the nation-state principle or a democrat, then you should have the ability to trade independently. But at the moment we don't. We've siphoned it all off to the EU Trade Commission, and that's no way a nation-state should govern its trade. Another thing about free trade agreements and customs unions is that Commonwealth countries that have their own do not need to be bound by one another. If we look at New Zealand, currently they're creating a free trade deal with India, but not to be outdone by their Antipodean neighbour. Australia is doing likewise. But Australia and New Zealand together have their own free trade agreement, and they don't bar anyone else. They want to trade with people, whereas Britain unfortunately can't do that when we're tied to the EU customs union. Another thing I'd like to make clear is there's an EU mission creep going on. I spoke to someone close to the Singapore High Commission, and they told me that the EU was putting pressure on them to open their legal firms and their banks to European ones because they believed that the UK had an unfair advantage. Singapore's response was simply, we already have a working relationship of 200 years with the United Kingdom. We have the same legal systems and we operate similar banking systems. And the example of that is Standard Chartered, which is all over the world and started as a Commonwealth entity. Moving on to trade partners, our biggest trade partner is the United States, followed by Germany, followed by France. If we just look at European trade, 1/5 of all of our exports go to Germany. If you add France and Holland into a mix, that's a top three that takes 50% of all of our exports. You add another two, which is Belgium and Ireland, it's a whopping 70%. So that, we're in a customs union with 26 other states, but only 5 of them take 70% of our goods. And we're barred from trading with other people freely and fairly. This leads on to trade balances. Our trade balance with the European Union is 41 billion, which is astonishing. But if you look at Germany specifically, in the year 2000, our trade deficit with Germany was 3.7 billion, which is not too great. But if you fast forward to 2010, it's a whopping 16.8 billion. We need to balance that somehow. And this is where the Commonwealth comes in. If you compare the Commonwealth in terms of balances, we have a healthy one, and trade, most importantly, is reciprocal. But this goes back to my major concern that the UK has joined an economic bloc that runs massive deficits with the majority of these nations, but only tiny surpluses for the remaining few. Going back to trade statistics just for one moment, the EU's own trading patterns with countries outside the EU has the UK as a substantial trade partner. 1/5, and it's worth reiterating, 1/5 of all Singapore, Australian and Indian trade with the EU is British. And 1/5 of EU Canadian exports is British, and almost 1/5 of EU USA exports are British. This is where we talk about a Commonwealth factor. People say that you can reduce business rates by 15% if you speak the same language, you have the same legal systems, and you can generally read other people. Now, this is hard to demonstrate using statistics, but I've gone round and spoken to High Commissions, and the strongest support I had was from the Indian High Commission. And they said, India feels there is a Commonwealth factor. You just pick up the phone or write an email knowing you can speak English. It's important for a start, you don't need an interpreter to do business with. And we all know in the EU, they have more interpreters than they do MEPs. And you can deal directly face to face, and you can read someone's intentions, which is all important. And the systems are so similar, whereas in China, they're so different. And that point, I think, is very telling. To bring it to a close, I believe my recommendations show that the Commonwealth can work, provided it is reformed and we have the political will. Throughout my interviews and conversations, developing and emerging nations have told me that they want the Commonwealth to be a trade track and a trade track alone. And they want it to morph into an institution that reflects this preference. As for Europe, she will always be our neighbour, but she's not our family. We must, of course, be good neighbours, but when problems become too great, we must look to kindred spirits. We have scattered a language, a legal system, a business ethos, and democratic institutions across the globe. Others have now surpassed us, and we must relearn from the likes of Singapore, New Zealand, and Rwanda in terms of prosperity. I urge the audience to buy a copy of the paper, to wear the wristbands that we have, and to campaign positively to leave the EU Customs Union, as well as to be the champion of British business to do that worldwide. This is our chance to shape history and to imagine a world outside the European Union in terms of prosperity. Now, I freely admit the Commonwealth needs reactivating, but at present it sleeps dormant in the heart of growing economies. Finally, if this paper were to have one objective, then it would be to show all Commonwealth businesses a path to mutual prosperity, and I hope you'll all join us on the next step of the journey. Thank you very much.